Defence Secretary Grant Shapps standing by for us this morning. Good of you to take the time, Mr Shapps, as always. Thank you. Are we on a war footing?
We certainly want to make sure our industrial production is on a war footing so that we can produce more of the things that we need, more of the things needed in Ukraine, make sure that we have better stockpiles of those things for the future. So we know we're living in a more dangerous world. This extra £75 billion for defence is our way of making sure that we lead, particularly in Europe, when it comes to defending our continent.
Sky News, our Deborah Haynes, learned from a former RAF intelligence officer that the UK is far from prepared for war. What do you say in response to that?
Well, look, I hope that we're not about to go to war in the UK, but there are very few other militaries in the world who have the global reach that we do. We've just seen our armed forces, the RAF specifically, in action in the Middle East, shooting down those incoming projectiles from Iran. We've seen how we've assisted in Ukraine, and yesterday I've given Ukraine an extra £500 million to bring our total to £3 billion this year, plus our biggest ever gifting set of equipment to Ukraine yesterday. So we've got that global reach, and we've got armed forces prepared to be used and who are incredibly professional. Very few other countries can say that. We're the second biggest spender in NATO, and by far and away, as the NATO Secretary General said yesterday, the biggest spenders on defence in Europe as well. So I think we are doing our part, and we're actually part of saying we're going to hit this 2.5% and setting out the timetable is to encourage other countries to follow us, and the NATO budget would be very significantly bigger, at £135 billion bigger if they did that.
We may be the biggest spender, but not as a percentage of GDP, are we? I mean, Poland, Greece, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary all spend more as a proportion of GDP than we do.
That's right. There are some countries who are much closer to Russia who are spending more of their GDP, though it should be pointed out much, much less in cash terms because their economies would be very much smaller. And I was in Poland yesterday announcing this with the Prime Minister. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are countries go further. On the other hand, Britain set the 2% NATO target at a summit in Wales back in 2014 to be met by this year. The majority of NATO, but not all of it, now hit 2% plus. We're now saying we think that should be 2.5%. We think in a more dangerous world that would make sense. And as I say, we've got by far and away the largest defence budget in Europe. The important thing is to use that both to do good and encourage other people to step up as well.
But as I said, not as a proportion of GDP. Do you think that NATO should officially increase the spending target?
Yes, I do, actually. And I will be arguing that, and I know the Prime Minister feels strongly about this, when we go to the NATO 75th anniversary summit, which is in Washington, DC, and we'll say that 2% 10 years ago, when we didn't have the significant rise of China, North Korea, now nuclear armed, Iran attacking and using its proxies to attack, and a very much less stable world given Russia's actual invasion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think the extra is definitely justified, and we think that 2.5% should be that new target. And as I say, if everyone did that, be an extra £135 billion a year into NATO's defence budget, it would make a real difference.
Okay. I was having a flick through your 2019 manifesto, as I often do when I can't sleep, and Boris Johnson promised to increase spending by 0.5% above inflation every year until the end of the Parliament. So in fact, although you're increasing to 2.5%, it's still far short of what Boris Johnson had promised at the last election.
I'd have to go back and check the figures, but sometimes the numbers aren't quite. So, for example, even before yesterday's announcement, we increased in real terms by 1.8% the defence budget in the budget that just passed, where a lot of people are saying there was no increase. So a lot of time, be 1.8. I don't know if that would therefore qualify under what you said. Of course, when that manifesto was written in 2019, no one knew we were going to have a 100 years pandemic. And a war in Europe. Between the two of them, easily £500 billion of costs to the economy. So I think it's actually even more significant, great leadership by the Prime Minister. that yesterday we've stepped up and said, despite all of that, because of good management of the economy, in particular, the success of getting inflation down from over
I
11%
understand.
caused by the Putin price
I get
hike
that.
on energy down to just above 3%.
I
Now is
get
the
that.
time to go to 2.5%. In other words, £75 billion more for defence.
Okay, but of course, as we both know, the first rule of any government is to keep its citizens safe. To that end, you suggest increasing our budget, our defence budget, to 2.5% of gross domestic product. Colonel Simon Diggins, former British Defence Attaché and a former military man, told us that yesterday, actually, here on the show, told us that spending should be closer to 3%. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I can tell you as an absolute fact, if you gave me 3% of GDP to spend on defence tomorrow or very quickly, I would not be able to spend that in any other way than buying equipment from abroad. So I would have to go to America and other places. They probably couldn't supply it because the global defence industrial base hasn't expanded quickly enough to deal with the enormous requirements in Ukraine. And so I wouldn't be able to spend the money as the simple answer, and certainly not domestically. What this government wants to do is expand our industrial base for defence production, particularly for things like munitions. We need the missiles and the rest of it. We need our stockpiles to be higher. And to do that, we need to build up our defence sector. And being able to signal the exact timetable for 2.5% means that when I was talking to the industry yesterday, they were saying, this is great because we now know we can invest with confidence in order to make sure that we're able to produce the missiles and other things in a much more steady fashion. So it will mean
First
not
time a
only,
defence secretary's ever said to me, don't give me 3% because I wouldn't be able to spend it.
but as I say, we want to not only build our own industrial base for defence, but also be able to export those things abroad. So the way to do this in a manner that will actually be great for British jobs and enable us to defend ourselves and enable us to not simply buy everything from abroad, and it's very hard to buy anything at the moment because of the pull from Ukraine and other conflicts, is to build our own defence industrial base. And you need to have a straight line as we're doing here in order to get there. And one of the great things about this £75 billion extra we announced yesterday is it is a straight line to that.
Okay. Before I let you go, I know that you're a father. Talk to me about the tragedy that we saw in the Channel yesterday. This government thinks that Rwanda will be a deterrent for migrants. The threat of death is not a deterrent for migrants. So how can Rwanda be more of a deterrent than the threat of death? 100 and odd people on a boat.
It's just, I mean, just heartbreaking to see it and to hear stories. And we have to break these criminal gangs. And as you say, if the already significant risks aren't a deterrent, then the thing that will be a deterrent is actually, even if you come here, not being able to stay here, because the legislation that we have fought through Parliament that passed against Keir Starmer and the Labour Party's objections is to say that if you come here illegally, you will not stay here. And that is so fundamental to
But they know that, and they're still getting on the boats.
Activities.
They know that, and they're still putting 7-year-old children, their children, on the boats with them.
It's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking to see. But break that, to stop those boats from sailing. You have to make it clear that if you sail, you essentially don't get to Britain, or the moment you do, you leave again. And then that breaks the criminal gang activity. And since nothing else is actually breaking it, I'm amazed we've had to fight tooth and nail to get this passed. The Labour Party's objections to actually putting something back. And this is their alternative. What are they proposing to do? They don't have a plan for this, and we'll be right back at square one. So we have to have that plan in place. I'm very pleased it's passed Parliament finally this week. And it's time to break the criminal gangs to stop destroying people's lives like that.
Thank you, as always, Defence Secretary.
Thank you.